Something that brands tend to do when they have a hot model is release it in a range of new and exciting colours. When they do, there's usually an accompanying song and dance to promote the new release. Usually, but not always, like in this case. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're looking at a watch that was very quietly released by Seiko in September 2024, in collaboration with the Japanese retailer TicTac to celebrate their 40th anniversary in business. This is the SZSB032. If all of that sounds a bit familiar, it might be because 5 years ago they did the exact same thing for their 35th anniversary, releasing the SZSB006, a black-dialed watch that many were calling Seiko's equivalent to the Explorer. In fact, at the time there were actually 4 colours released: the black 006, silver 007, green 021, and blue 028. On release, these watches captured a lot of attention, and even as recently as 2023, 4 years after the release, there were still articles being written calling for new releases or new versions. With so much interest from buyers and enthusiasts, you'd think that if Seiko finally did release a new model in this design, arguably the one major colour missing from the original lineup, it would be the talk of the town. And yet it's not. Neither Seiko nor the watch community has had much at all to say about this watch. As I'm making this video, there are currently no others at all on YouTube, and only a couple of Reddit posts here and there from people who own one. I don't think this is because people don't like the watch. I think Seiko has really dropped the ball on marketing and promoting this new release. In fact, looking at the photos from the announcement, they make the watch look washed out, plain, and very average. You might disagree, but I think even wrist shots I've taken with my phone make the watch look better than those. So, why isn't Seiko promoting this watch more? I really don't know, but I think it's a release that a lot more people would be interested in if they knew about it. As it is, this watch has only been released as a JDM model through TicTac stores with a retail price of 55,000 yen, which at the current exchange rate in January 2025 is just under $350. Because it's only been released in Japan, buying this watch might be a bit tricky. However, if you watched my recent video where I explained how to find and buy rare, cheap or interesting watches, you'll know I was able to purchase this one using Buyee, who have also sponsored this video. A big thank you to them. If you don't already know, Buyee is a proxy buying service that lets you shop from Japanese retailers and platforms that you wouldn't normally have access to. You can bid on Yahoo auctions, shop on Mercari, Rakuten and a range of other places that only ship domestically within Japan. The items you order are shipped to Buyee in Japan, who then ship the items to you. You can also combine items into single packages to save on shipping costs. With the exchange rates the way they are at the moment, there are definitely some bargains to be had. If you want to see how to find them, go back and check out my other video. In the description below, you'll also find a link to sign up where you'll get 10% off your first order, so you can save even more. Thanks again to Buyee for sponsoring this video. Now back to the watch, let's take a closer look. It follows the same basic formula as the original 006 and other models from 2019. Not that that's a bad thing, but brightens things up with this creamy off-white dial. The original black dial had a bit of a vintage look going for it, but I think this cream dial takes it a step further. As we'll see later, it works really well when we get it off the bracelet and onto some straps. It's a very flat, matte colour, unlike some of those other sunburst options. For a watch that leans into the vintage aesthetic the way this one does, I think it's just about perfect. It's combined with printed hour markers that have a slightly more yellow tone to them. Before receiving the watch, I was a little concerned about how it would look based on the stock photos we saw earlier. On a more stark white backdrop, I usually don't like the way aged lume looks, such as on this Hamilton khaki here. But in person, with that thankfully cream coloured dial, the effect is not as jarring at all. In fact, I think it works quite well. These markers have thin black frames printed to help them stand out against the dial, though probably the most prominent design elements of the dial are the 12 and 6 numerals printed in black. And we'll see that the use of this black on the front of the watch is a recurring theme. Seiko used quite a rounded font for these numbers. If you look closely at the 6, you can see that it doesn't actually join up. The use of these two numerals became something of a signature for this line, and, aside from the versatile everyday design, was probably part of the reason the watches drew comparisons to the Rolex Explorer. Along with those hour markers, the minute track has also been printed in black. There are partial minutes also marked to provide some visual detail and frame the dial as a whole, with the markers for each minute extending further inwards. This visual frame around the dial takes what is a pretty large dial and shrinks it a little, just enough to make it very comfortable to wear. At 3, in addition to a shrunken hour marker, there's a cutout for the date. This too has been framed with a fine black line printed around it. The date wheel beneath is pure white, which stands out a little, but is probably as close to colour matched as we can expect from Seiko. The other printing on the dial is located beneath the pinion, and consists of 3 lines of text: automatic, 23 joules, 10 bar. I have to admit, it kind of bothers me that all 3 lines use completely different fonts. Automatic is printed in the classic cursive script we see on many other Seiko models. 23 joules is in all caps, and in this serif font. And finally, 10 bar uses a much more modern looking sans serif font. I'd have liked to see either just automatic, or even automatic 23 joules down here, to enhance the already clean design of the dial. The joule count being printed on the dial is not something you see with many modern watches, so including it here does add to the vintage vibe of the watch a little, but I think the water resistance rating is completely unnecessary. That's all for the printing, but there is actually one piece of applied material on the dial. That is of course the Seiko logo sitting proudly above the pinion. It, like all of the printing, is in black, which really pops against the dial behind it. I think the consistent use of black on the front of the watch looks very purposeful and intentional, and does a good job of tying everything together. Just like the logo, the hands on this watch have an all black finish too. They are a classic cathedral handset, just like the ones on the Alpinist, and the contrast between the black surrounds and the creamy lume is really nice. Overall, I'd say they could be a little bit bigger, but as it is, don't feel small. Covering all of this is the crystal, and since it's a Seiko, you can probably guess what's coming here. We've got Hardlex, of course, Seiko's proprietary version of mineral crystal. It will scratch more easily than sapphire, but unlike sapphire, it won't shatter on impact. So there are pros and cons. It's got a subtle doming, which I really like, and is a single dome with a flat underside, hence the distortion at more extreme angles. Let's take a step back and look at the case. Overall, the case is very wearable and will suit most wrists besides the smallest out there. Starting with dimensions, there is the universally popular 40mm diameter paired with a 20mm lug width. The height is increased ever so slightly by the domed crystal, but still comes in at a reasonable 12.9mm. Though longer than some other Seiko cases, the lug-to-lug measurement remains manageable at 48mm. Measurements only tell half the story though. The shape of the case can have just as much effect on how the watch wears, and thankfully this one is a good one. Up front, we have a relatively slim polished bezel sitting atop a brushed uppercase surface. The lugs narrow to fine points at their tips, and on the right hand side, smoothly transition into the crown guards, which further contribute to the sportiness of the watch. That transition is not just in terms of shape, but also finishing. The brushing seamlessly becomes polishing by the time those crown guards start to extend from the case side. Looking from the side, we can see that it's a pretty simple slab-sided case that has been completely high polished, but it does curve down very nicely towards the end of the lugs, which help it to hug the wrist when worn. From here, we also get a look at some drilled lugs, very handy for changing out the bracelet for other straps. From this side, looking at the crown, it's unsigned, which, to be quite honest, doesn't bother me all that much. It doesn't screw down, but we know the watch still manages 100 meters of water resistance, thanks to that being advertised on the dial. What does screw down is the case back, and here we get a look at the movement ticking away inside. Just like the original SZSB006, this watch houses the 4R35 automatic movement. It hacks, hand winds, has 40 hours of power, beats 6 times per second, and is found in not just Seiko watches, but a plethora of other micro brands and other AliExpress brands. Also on the window is printed TicTac limited edition, though I'm not really sure how limited it actually is. I haven't been able to find that number anywhere so far. I've talked a little bit already about the different tones to the lume on the hands and indices, but is the lume any good in the first place? Well, yes. Especially for a printed dial, I think it's surprisingly decent. Of course, it's not on the same level as something like a diver, but it does have a nice blue glow when the lights go out. One interesting side note is that all three Tic Tacs I have at the moment have been lumed differently. This one has the hands and hour markers, the black 006 has all that plus the 12 and 6, whereas the silver 007 has only the hands loomed. There is a nice bit of contrast created as well between the cool blue colour of the lume and the warm creaminess of the dial. The last thing to cover here is the bracelet. It's probably the weakest part of this watch. It looks like a 3-piece link and does suit the watch reasonably well, but the links are actually just one piece designed to look like 3. What I do really like about it is the taper. It goes from 20mm at the lugs to 16 by the time it gets to the clasp. A 4mm taper suits the vintage vibe and is just comfortable all around. It's definitely serviceable, but when compared to the rest of the watch, it isn't quite as solid. That's both in terms of feel and construction. First, there are the end links, which are hollow. Then, there are the links themselves, which are also folded. If you look very carefully, you can see that faint seam running down the side of the link. It took me a good few minutes of looking to find that seam, so Seiko has hidden it very well. It does feel fine once on the wrist, but holding it in hand, it does feel a little rattly. Finally, we have the clasp. It's small and unobtrusive, which is a plus, but that is achieved through a pressed outer shell with 3 positions of adjustment and a pressed inner mechanism. For me, it's not the end of the world, but for you it might be a deal breaker. I think where this watch really shines is on the strap though, so, at least for a little while, that bracelet will be coming off anyway. Before we do that though, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. On my fairly average 7-inch wrist, I think you'll agree that it looks right at home. The lugs finish nicely well before the edges of my wrist, and as I turn it, the polishing on the bezel has a chance to catch and play with the light. Thanks to the curve of the lugs, it sits very low and flat on the wrist, even though it's pushing 13mm in thickness. And legibility was never going to be an issue with those black hands against a cream dial. However, I think where that dial can really look its best is on a brown leather strap, like this one here. The warm tones in the dial match perfectly with the warm tones in the brown, and the accent stitching picks out the yellow lume hour markers too. I generally tend to pick bracelets over straps, but for the most part, I've been wearing this watch on the strap instead. I think it takes the watch from about a 7 out of 10 to a 9. So, clearly this watch has some shortcomings, which I've touched on already. The mismatched lume is a little disappointing, and the bracelet is definitely the weakest part of the watch, with hollow end links, and clasp. That said, I think the charm of that dial colour and understated design still make this a very worthwhile option to consider. I wasn't expecting to enjoy this watch as much as I have, but that's also thanks in part to the very average promotional photos used. Add to that the fact that it was only released in Japan, and has barely been promoted at all, and you end up with a release that not many people are aware of, but, based on the original release, should definitely be getting a lot more attention than it is. If you're interested in getting one of these for yourself, don't forget to check out the link in the description below to find one through Buy and get 10% off your first order. A big thanks again to them for sponsoring this video and making it possible. What do you think about this watch? Had you seen this one when it was released? Do you prefer one of the other original colours? Is this whole range overhyped? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.